To date, nothing I've said in an episode of Glass of Water has provoked more ire than in Guard Break, where I suggested that children ought to deal with their bullies through the use of violence. Not the first time I've advocated violence as a solution. I've long been in favor of Starlight Glimmer getting a laser beam through the skull, and I think the governor of Michigan should be executed for knowingly poisoning the people of Flint. And I've long held a very dismissive attitude about pacifism. While I'm not the crazed serial killer that neo-reactionaries like to pretend I am, I'm not going to pretend like neo-Nazis and KKK members getting murdered is anything but good news. That doesn't sit well with people. When I think about violence as a story concept as well as a moral concept, my mind always comes back to The Last Airbender. In the final few episodes, Aang is caught with a moral dilemma. As an airbender, he swore an oath never to take a life. But leaving Fire Lord Ozai alive is practically begging for another war to start. Aang goes to seek the wisdom of previous avatars, all of which tell him that they were just as hesitant as him and it was catastrophic. In a last-ditch effort, Aang contacts an air nomad, Avatar Yang Chen, in the hopes of getting the affirmation he desires. Instead, Yang Chen tells him that his insistence on sticking to his air nomad principles while the world continues to burn around him is selfish, and that as the Avatar, he needs to let go of his pride. Watching this, I was on the edge of my seat because it was the first time that the series had introduced a genuine moral dilemma. Does Aang do the quote-unquote right thing and let the world continue to suffer, or does he kill the Fire Lord and end the 100-Year War? And he likely wasn't going to come out of this feeling all good and happy about himself, and the knowledge that he'd killed the Fire Lord would have haunted him for the rest of his life. For a few brief moments, Avatar had gone from being a great show to the greatest show ever made. And then they ruined it. In a move that was rather prophetic in hindsight, Aang learns how to take away someone's bending and depowers the Fire Lord, and all that valuable writing with the spirits of the previous avatars was just pissed away. Aang was presented with a genuine moral dilemma and found a way to back out of it at the last second, and completely spoiled what could have been a really interesting conclusion to his character arc. The transformation of a moral choice into a choice about selfishness versus the welfare of others meant nothing because we could have an all-around happy ending anyway. What makes Avatar stick out is that this dilemma was actually interesting. You know how games like Undertale or Dragon Age keep pushing the your choices affect the world concept, but your choices only ever really amount to be nice to people or murder everything? How the evil options in these sort of games amounts to little more than just killing people for giggles? You remember how Fallout 3's big moral decision was, do you want to kill a whole town of people or not? I don't know anyone who actually did blow up Megaton because you were never given an adequate reason as to why it needed to be destroyed. And that's in a game made for adults where you can be more direct in what the problems with that world are. It's a common sentiment among most people that violence is never the answer, a sentiment only reinforced by lazy writing where the violent options are either never justified or completely unnecessary. However, reality never quite works out that way, and this kind of narrative instills a false sense of what's moral in a lot of people. Violence is the worst thing in the world, we say, and yet we celebrate people whose job involves violence and never question the dissonance. We take great glee in violence as a form of cathartic entertainment in stories where violence literally solves all our problems, but suddenly get very skittish when someone suggests approaching a problem the same way in real life. Neo-Nazis can assault, murder, and terrorize people with very little worthwhile criticism, but the moment people start fighting back, we've got all sorts of hand-wringing about stooping to their level. While pacifism is a philosophy I fundamentally disagree with, I can at least understand it most of the time. Martin Luther King was big on non-violent protests, and a lot of worthwhile modern activism groups from third-wave feminism to Black Lives Matter are of the non-violent variety. I want you to focus really hard on this sentence because it's going to be important. As a rule, if a peaceful solution is possible and effective, of course it's objectively better. The problem is, what do you do when those peaceful solutions fail? My objection is to people who claim that violence is never a solution, rather than the far more reasonable position of violence being the last-ditch effort when all other avenues have been exhausted. The smug, preening knobsacks sitting safe at their desk and assuring everyone that physical force is always the worst thing you could ever resort to, filled with empty, worthless platitudes about the moral high ground. Here's a comment someone left on Guard Break saying that if someone is trying to kill you and you kill them in response, then you've just stooped to their level, and saying that as a condemnation of 100% legal self-defense. You know what? I'm not really all that concerned about whether or not I've stooped to someone's level. If someone's trying to kill me, I'm concerned about whether or not I'm going to be alive by the end of this encounter, not whether or not I'm sat comfortably on a moral high ground that doesn't really exist. Likewise with bullying. When the vast majority of schools showcase that they'd rather sweep the issue of bullying under the rug and refuse to address it in any meaningful way, what the hell are these kids supposed to do? What possible reason is there to give that they shouldn't beat their tormentors into the dirt? Because it's wrong? I mean, that's the reason. Because it's wrong. Assault is certainly illegal except in situations of self-defense, and we've all been taught that diplomacy is a morally superior option to physical force. Sure, it's morally wrong. It's not exactly an argument that speaks to the value of being on the moral high ground though, does it? It doesn't sell me on anything. If you have an alternative solution, I'd love to hear it. Problem is, a lot of people don't. Whenever it's suggested that children deal with their bullies by getting physical, social media is full of cries of violence only begets more violence, and other similar platitudes that are easy to make when you're sat comfortably at home, privileged to not have to be around these kind of cretins. But whenever I ask them if they have a better idea, guess what I get? More platitudes, more vagary, no concrete practical solutions that would work better than just clobbering someone in the head. That's not selling me on anything, that's just appealing to morality. And it's conservatives appealing to morality too, which is fucking rich. There was even more sentiment about how clobbering your bullies would lead them to bringing their friends to beat you up in return, and no, it won't. Maybe 1 in 100 will. I'm not saying that this is a perfect solution, it doesn't work all the time, but the vast majority of bullies, both young and old, historically look for easy targets. It's why schoolyard bullies always go after the small kid. It's why children on Tumblr are a conservative's favorite scapegoat, because it's easy and requires little effort. When their victims fight back, they don't fight back harder, they go and find a different victim and the cycle begins anew. If there was ever a word to describe bullies, coward would certainly be it. All of the supposed non-violent solutions to bullying rely on people in authority stepping in and intervening, and any victim of bullying will tell you that teachers and parents have historically never given a shit, and you're given solutions that don't actually address the problem. Just ignore it and let the person making your life miserable run around unchecked. Remember how Avatar Yang Chen chastised Aang for putting his selfish moralizing above the needs of others? That's exactly what's going on here. It's easy to sit back and repeat an empty phrase like violence only begets more violence when you don't have to confront things like bullying, when it's all safely behind you and you've forgotten the damage it can deal. It's easy because it takes no effort and you get the selfish satisfaction of appealing more virtuous. It's like saying you don't filter comments because you believe in free speech. Do you really? Or are you just lazy and don't give a shit? I promise you, if by default you had to manually approve every comment on a YouTube video, most people wouldn't bother. But being honest about that fact doesn't give you the same smug self-satisfaction as declaring yourself a believer of a law you have absolutely zero effect on. How many people complained about Keemstar and drama alerts, tabloid rumor mongering, but nobody wanted to actually do anything about it and just spoke about the problem in vague tones while refusing to name names, because that would apparently make them as bad as Keemstar. It is worth mentioning, because the reductionist morons who couldn't understand nuance if they were lectured about it every day are already writing the responses about how I'm a deranged serial killer, that not condemning all forms of violence does not mean I think people should go on murder rampages. There's a big difference between I think this person deserves to die and I think this person deserves a good ass kicking. And just like in Guard Break, if you want to sit there and ignore the problem while everyone else is affected by it, then by all means. But don't start to presume yourself a morally virtuous person because you dress up your fuck you got mine attitude with pretty words. I'm not concerned about being seen as morally virtuous. Who the fuck is in a position to judge me for it? God? Yeah, glass houses, buddy. As someone who would rather find solutions to problems, I don't have time for that sanctimonious shit. I don't really care if some paint-drinking moron thinks that I'm becoming just as bad as the bullies. Despite what your favorite Batman quote would like to tell you, someone who kills a killer does not suddenly become a killer in return. We have the police and the military whose literal taxpayer-funded job is to kill killers. Do you look on them as being just as bad as the Mafia or ISIS? Of course you fucking don't. Because violence only begets more violence is a knee-jerk phrase that people spit out without thinking because it sounds correct. It is not, however, actually right. The world just isn't that simple, and stripping the nuance out of a situation to boil it down to a simple light side or dark side decision is fundamentally stupid. The vast majority of times, bullies are deterred when you hurt them. The US Army isn't going to talk ISIS down from the mountain like their starlight glimmer. You're not going to suddenly discover energy bending. And if you're someone who ignores these problems because you're more concerned with sounding virtuous and not actually offering a worthwhile solution, then kindly fuck yourself off the nearest pier. Nobody has time for your selfish, sanctimonious crap. Help contribute to a real solution or go sulk in the corner while the grown-ups do the real work. We have the police and the military whose literal taxpayer Taxpayer pundit, fucking Christ.